We can't see you at all. All we see is two lights.
We know there are at least 2 rows of people, but beyond that, who knows?
Oh, there are people there. Okay, sorry.
Hello, art world. Hello, world.
Okay.
Well, I just want to start, for those of you who came here expecting Jerry's wife to be in conversation on stage, apologies. That's a show that I would have liked to be here to see too. And I do want to ask you a little bit later about what you've learned from Roberta as a critic. But, let's start with the book. This is a chronicle of a couple of decades of the art world. It's also, your life in the art world, but really beginning in the late 90s up through the present day, chronicling a number of what you describe as really monumental changes in that world. And you situate those changes in what you call the collapse of modernism. That is, one of the things that we are seeing and have seen over the last couple of decades is what is replacing modernism or taking the place of modernism. I thought that might be a good place to start. What do you mean by the collapse of modernism? What does modernism mean that's different today than it meant 20 or 30 years ago? And how has that shaped the art world that you live in, the gallery world, the museum world, and the art world that many people here tonight spend a lot of time into, I'm sure?
It's a great question because it is an arc all the way through the book. The book is the story of the art of the 21st century and the enormous changes that have taken place. One of them is what I've called, and I edited it with the best editor of my life back then at New York Magazine, you.
Yeah.
And we called the article, "What the Hell Was Modernism?" Because, first of all, it was the longest lasting art movement in the history of art. The Renaissance only lasts, say, 40 years, 50 years. The Rococo is 15 years long. Impressionism is followed almost immediately by post-impression, ism after ism after ism, and that's what modernism was about. What's called a teleological growth, where one male would kill another male until my ism was bigger than your ism. And what happened is everybody drank the same Kool-Aid, and at a certain point, I think that you could no longer really believe it. First of all, it excluded 51% of the population, who had been excluded for 50,000 years, women.
Not just women.
And not just women, but all unrepresented artists. The art world came up with a squirrely expression called outsider artists. And I wrote in the book, we should have to call ourselves insider artists. The point being that at a certain point, I guess, in the early 2000s, it was no longer believable that one movement should lead to the next, that art should be about the making of itself. And then came one of the most bizarre Oedipal daddy issue art movements of all time that didn't even notice that it called itself after the previous movement, a little thing called postmodernism, where art became something that only people in the art world actually could understand. And finally, this book covers the absolute giving away of that, and in a sense, the giving away of art history of when this movement collapsed in this century. You started to understand that all of them were a bit skewed. And we're now living in a complete rewriting of art history.
So
this is how we used to work together. I would talk for an hour, and then he would ask me one thing, and I'd get it wrong.
So we have this period succeeding modernism, an extended modernist period. We lose the teleological sense of history. We lose the exclusive, white male identity aspect of it. What else do we lose? What are the other features marking this new era off of that old era?
we lose and gain a lot. All the art made in this period, from the contested 2000 election to the contested 2020 election, to the Bush-Cheney war machine, to Obama, to the pandemic, to George Floyd. In the fall of modernism, at the same time, we also do lose that idea of who does make the artist, who is it for? The audience essentially becomes very popular. Art turns very outward looking. You have huge biennials. You have intimate art, in a way, has a harder time in these big museums and big biennials. I think what we lost was a mooring, and that the positive side of losing that was that anybody had a stake in the game and anybody might be able to play. Your wife opened up a really great art gallery on the Lower East Side and made a go of it in that period. At the same time, though, we gained mega galleries.
Yeah, I mean, when I think about this period, you've described it as art made in a period of political rage and political disarray. And that's obviously true when we think about, the cultural period from, say, the 2000 election to, say, the 2020 election. We're not just talking about those two sort of bookends, but a period of time in which a huge amount that was sort of taken for granted as the cultural infrastructure of our world came into question. So, 9/11 ended dreams of American hegemony. The 2008 financial crisis ended our illusions about sort of, whatever perpetual globalist neoliberal growth. We had the pandemic shaking our sense of safety in this world. We now have our sense of democracy being shaken, not just in the US, but really all around the world. And in all of that ferment and disarray, there is a huge amount of rage. But when I think about this period in the art world, I don't think of it as being opening up and grand and public. I think of it as being cloistered and oligarchic. And those biennials are bigger, those art fairs are bigger, there are more people going to them, there are more people Instagramming from them, and yet still it feels more exclusive to me than when I think about the art world that you sort of came up in, the art world that you came to New York in of the 80s.
Yeah.
Certainly when I think about the Warhol era, these are figures that were famous well beyond the art world. And now I sort of struggle to see who is occupying that place today. When you think about this period of art, these last 20 years, and see public rage, who are you thinking of? Like, who are the avatars of that? Who are the embodiments of that? Whose work and sort of personas tell that story for you?
A couple of things before I name some names. The art world, and a lot of it is in the book, going to sort of battle against the auctions, the fact that we're all going to work for David Zwirner or Gagosian someday. And that
if not already.
Well, if not already. And in another sense, in my job and in yours, kids, if you're in the art world, we're all part of this. You can't get outside of it. I was lambasting. We invented a fake Da Vinci, which I cover here. Charged $400 million for it. I have no degrees whatsoever. I looked at the thing in this super inflated oligarchic art world, to be sure, but that was making national news. I, with no degrees, looked at it and was the first person to go, this thing is dead. It's not real at all. And I wrote, in my own way, why it was unreal. It was almost like listening to Republican congressmen on background, where curators would call me and say, I know it isn't real. And I would say, why not just say that? Well, our jobs are dependent on it, my position. They were hoping, and I know I'm not really quite answering it, but I'm so into the carbuncles that formed in this period that might be being lanced, that they were just afraid to come forward with it, hoping other people would.
But it's a really interesting and illuminating story, in part because it really does illustrate, at least at some levels of the art world, what is going on as something like money laundering. People deciding they want to put a huge amount of money into this asset class that they themselves can determine the value of, both in a literal way and in a sort of cultural way. And while that's going on, while that sort of, crazily wealthy inside trading is going on, there are also people like living in their studios and slaving over their work and living as, starving artists always have for the sake of what they're doing. And one of the things I've always found so remarkable about your work as a critic is that even when you're looking at the work of people who are the faces of that wealthy world, you still see them as part of the invisible struggling army, and see their work as, screaming expressions of who they are and what they see. But how is that possible? How can people in a world dominated by so much money, in which there is so much careerism and bureaucracy, how do they find a way to make the work that they need to make, and how do you see that work evolving in this period in particular?
This takes us to the paradox of all of it. Yes, we're awash in money, art and money having sex in public nonstop, profligately. Now, people are ethics washing. You have far right-wing people that were appointed, say, to Trump's election committee and all that, are the board members of museums. I guess what I would remind people is that only 1% of 1% of 1% of all artists are those artists that you're talking about. The problem is, and this is what the book tries to deal with, is that 99% of the attention is paid to that 0.1%. When everyone else, you in this room, you, I, are having a life lived in art, 30-year careers that build, that go up, that go down. The paradox has taken us to this place where we are taking their money. Now, do you think we're deluding ourselves? Some people might. On the other hand, do you sell to somebody that voted against somebody that you like? Artists tend to do that. And I want all artists to make money, the good, the bad, and the very bad. So that includes me. What we're living through is this paradox of the structure is obviously rotten. It's too big to fail, and it's too big not to fail. I think that those are the conditions on the ground. I would add one thing to what you said, too. After COVID came a second pandemic. Everybody rushed outside from being alone after George Floyd. And the art world, for the first time, instead of just talking the talk, for the very first time, this much is walking the walk. That there are enormous numbers of underrepresented artists showing their work. Older artists, less known artists, insiders, etc. That doesn't make art better, but it does begin for the first time in all of art history to let people see more of the story. And that's why I always end up optimistic, always. Like, art has never died since the caves. It's always been, it's never not been with us. It's using us to reproduce itself. But you don't seem satisfied, like it's big. Yes, if you look at the art world.
I get a lot of mileage out of my poker face with Jerry.
But when you look at the art world through that lens, it can't help but turn you cynical.
Well, I mean, I think I am a bit more cynical about it than you, but I still they're still titans who are walking and working among us. So, one of the people you write about at length in the book is Cara Walker, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit about her, not just the Sphinx, which was a sort of major work to break through. It was, paid for by the Two Trees people, right? It's part of the domino development, but
the paradox.
but it still towers above that foundation as a major work for you, especially. But really going back to where she came from when you first encountered her work and what you think her career means in this kind of ugly context.
Her work to me was like Goya. Do you know who Cara Walker is? It's a black artist who won the MacArthur. I was a teacher at RISD. I looked over her shoulder at her work, and I felt like the back of my head caught on fire. She was doing black silhouette cutouts, black paper cutouts of pickaninnies, black mammies being raped, killed, lynched, etc., in these great, huge panoramas. And I looked at her in school, and I remember thinking to myself, I'm not going to speak one word to this artist. There's nothing I can say. This is emerged fully formed. She went on with this work that's really little more than craft. Some of you are just boring ceramicists, and that's a high art, and yet we push that down, or sewing, or weaving, or cut out silhouettes. And when I talk about forward-facing, yes, her work is difficult to understand. Yes, most people walking on the streets on Halloween tonight don't know her work, but when you see it without a wall label, without any theorizing whatsoever, it tells the story, which is the last chapter of the book, the return of the long American night, is sort of the original sin. To me, that tells me art has an enormous power. Even if it's useless, it changes lives, and lives then change the world.
And who else would you put in that group? I mean, talking about major figures of the last couple of decades whose work really, immediately will last.
And by the way, when I say Cara Walker, this is an artist of color that I'm not naming in a demographic way. That's what I'm interested in, that you are a great artist, not a great Estonian artist like me, or a Scottish artist, or wherever your people are from. Is that where you're from?
It's half Jewish. And half English to the U.S. a long time ago, yeah.
I was thinking of Kerry James Marshall. He returned to another dead machine called history painting. And when I saw his work in the early 2000s, he's about 60 now, maybe older, I didn't think it was that good. I did not understand that with the death, the collapse of modernism, which artists always see these things first, he could crawl back into the corpse and make a sort of undoing of death, if you will, like a Frankenstein, of using other body parts, like all you squirrely artists in here, to make something new again. And he did that with history painting. And when he had his show at the Met, I have to be honest, I was like, this is really powerful. On the other hand, there might be a Swiss artist like Pipilotti Rist who would do huge rooms of video projections that made you feel like you were on peyote. And that too is part of life. We have to remember pleasure is an incredibly important form of knowledge. There's so many artists. Matthew Barney, who's so loathed by now, to me, he's like Wagner, and almost every Hollywood film made, you always say, not you, one says, well, art never affects life. I think almost every Hollywood film is made after Matthew Barney.
So why is he so loathed?
I think because the pointy-headed academic curators got a hold of him, took him away from people, and made him so obscure and never would talk about beauty, a more open narrative, sexuality, all this stuff. They had a million theories. When you read them, it's like reading most of art magazines these days. You read them, and you don't know what they're talking about. And to me, working with you my whole life, I wanted to write in my own voice. That's what the book is about. The kind of life we all live all the time in our lives, and we're thinking it, and then when you get to the official literature or the official taste, it somehow gets very dry, like art should be fasting and paying for some sort of punishment for being also useless and about pleasure.
So let's talk about your beginnings. So the book, it opens with a long meditation on Jericho's Raft of the Medusa, what it means about the contemporary moment and politics, which we've sort of touched on here. But then there's a sort of a second start, which is this essay that you wrote a few years ago called My Life as a Failed Artist. And it's autobiographical, but it also points to, I think, a lot of the sensitivities that I was talking about a few minutes ago about how capacious your emotional...
What is capacious? Big?
I knew that.
Yeah,
it's big in here.
But there too.
How much empathy you have
Yeah.
for every artist whose work you're standing in front of. And I wonder if you could take us back in time and talk a little bit about your period in Chicago as an artist, but also then, or maybe I'll ask it separately, but I do want to ask about the New York that you came to,
right.
What the art world was like then, and what you were like then in entering it.
I was raised in the suburbs of Chicago, walked past about 12 Frank Lloyd Wright homes on the way to and from high school. I knew nothing except wanting to meet girls and playing baseball, but I knew these spaces were special and that my life was chaos and that they seemed a safe space. I'm going to skip over some very big parts of like how I first saw art, but I became an artist because the people around me that were having sex, frankly, were in the theater or making art. And I thought, that's what I gotta try. And I tried to go to the Art Institute of Chicago, and I dropped out because I was a wise guy. I never went. I would go to all the Stop the War protests and civil rights, and I thought I knew much better, and left school. I have no degrees. I started a gallery in Chicago, curated 75 shows there, and about 100 jazz and blues concerts and stuff like that. It was an
Let me just pause
artist
you there.
space.
Like
Yeah.
you leave school, you start this gallery.
Yeah.
What mark were you trying to make in the world right then? Like, what did you want that space to be, and what did you want your work to be?
I was such an asshole that I wanted the world to see that me and my friends knew what art should be. And so we would show our own work, but the work of our generation, and show them that we knew better what art was. And I also want to say, as an outsider with no degrees, and I was a long-distance truck driver for about 10 years, somebody's holding cards up. Are we supposed to go there? No. As a long-distance truck driver for 10 years, my CB handle was the Jewish cowboy. I self-exiled after this period, but being from Chicago means that I grew up with mostly outsider art. I went to tiny rooms with the most famous blues and jazz musicians you could ever name and saw them this close, and they would sit at tables with us between because nobody was there. It was completely empty. So I had this feeling for outsiders. I became an artist, and then I listened to the demons. They told me I didn't know what I was doing, you didn't go to school, you don't know art history, you don't know how to draw. The same things you heard at 3:15 in the morning. To this day, when I post on Instagram at 2 in the morning, 50,000 people come on and go, I know how you feel. Like, it's just amazing, everybody's awake. But I was unable to be an artist, and that hurt. It hurt a lot, and it still gives me pain. I became this truck driver. I wanted to be something in the art world, so I taught myself to write at about the age of 40 years old. And at first I wrote how all art form wrote. Am I going on too long, you guys?
No.
Okay. I wrote, the commodified object of the late post-capitalist Marxian Deleuzian simulacra finds itself with a liminal haptic, space between the known nature and culture. And at first people would be like, you're really smart, Jerry. And I was like, I'm so smart. One day, because deadlines are sent to us from heaven via hell.
Just interrupt. Jerry, I've edited for 10 years. Jerry gets an assignment, goes to his computer, sits down, will not get up before he has filed a first draft. He's like the opposite of the stereotypical procrastinator. He's so stressed out that he has to finish the piece immediately.
Hello? That's because I wasted my life till I was 40. There is a background thrust of so much rocket fuel from knowing how lucky I am. If you want to know where my empathy comes from, I consider myself an outsider. I never had a shot. I had a second, third, fourth chance. I had no idea how to write. I still can't spell. I'm a slow reader. But I've never missed a deadline because what I do is I'm so scared when I work that I just burn up every single thing I have. An idiot idea often works. It's like Laurie Anderson said, is it smart enough? Is it dumb enough? Is it complicated enough? Is it simple enough? And is it magic? Those are the things I'm thinking about. So yeah, I sit down, write as hard as I can, and I want to write to you. I'm writing for the reader, not the artist, not the gallery. And I'm writing to people like me, who I think is us, that always feel a little intimidated, a little outside, and yet know that profound feeling that every time you see a work of art, even if it's crapola, it's brand new to you for a split second and shocking. And it might have seduced you. It might have gone, you there, I see you looking at me. Come closer. Come here. And I want to share these profoundly, radically vulnerable, embarrassing ideas with everyone. And the hell of deadlines is that they force you to do that.
But so why were you not able to, if fear is what's driving your productivity as a writer, why was fear so destructive to your life as an artist? What's the difference between writing and doing art that allows fear to work in this context and not in that context?
I've had to ask myself that a lot, and I've finally come to the understanding that while I wanted the sex from art, that I really wasn't an artist. I didn't have a relationship to materials, surface, shop talk of art, the years of learning how to mix oil paint. I couldn't stretch a painting. I didn't know carpentry. And when I was
But if you would never say that to some other artists, that they were not an artist because they didn't know how to do carpentry. You would say the opposite.
I was hard on myself like you're hard on yourself and you're hard on yourself. But when I was young, I listened. Now that by the time I was 40, I thought, I don't care. I'm going to listen to how bad I am and how fat my neck is and how bald I am and how bad at art history I am. But I don't give a shit. Because I'm a fucking genius in my head. In my head. And when I finish a piece, I always think, this fucking thing is great. And then I give it to an editor like David or Calvert Morgan, who edited this book magnificently at Riverhead, and they go, well, this doesn't work at all. And how did I always react when you told me that something didn't work or that it had to go?
Well, I would just back up and say the first thing that Jerry said to me when we started working together was, he said, I need one thing from you, which is I need you to send me an email within 15 minutes of my filing that says, this is brilliant. And then you can do whatever you want to it.
Right?
Which, like, actually was great advice to deal with all writers.
I want help. You made my work better. Cal makes it better. Your dealer will help you make your work better unless they're barking to do this or that. If you find somebody you trust, being part of the group mind instead of your idiot brain that thinks it knows things, but within 3 hours from now, we're all going to think different things. And that's what happens in the book a lot, where I'll even show myself changing my mind.
So to talk about the group mind a little bit, I do want to ask you, just tell me about the New York that you arrived in.
Right.
The New York art world of the mid-'80s. That's right?
Yeah.
Yeah. Which, you know, the young, interesting galleries were on the East Village. The establishment galleries were in Midtown. The artists making work were, you know, the Cindy Sherman, Richard Prince, like that era.
I would see Jean-Michel Basquiat riding his little bicycle. He was a terrifying sight because you saw somebody burning faster than life itself. I would see Julian Staubel sort of stomping around in his pajamas and thinking, you know, a Picasso model is possible. And I saw women with cameras like I had never seen before.
It's interesting that you started with Schnabel and Basquiat, because I think of your generationally as being much more of a pictures generation person.
Hated them. I didn't like Cindy Sherman at first, or my good friend Laurie Simmons, or Sarah Charlesworth, or Robert Longo. I like his work. Richard Prince, Sherry Levine, all of it seemed, what's this about? And their gallery, Metro Pictures, was so cool, I was afraid to go in. I couldn't stay up late enough for Keith Haring, Basquiat, and the club kids because they gave their lives to drugs. And that's not a bad thing. They gave it, I couldn't do it, but some people lived through it, and they gave their very bodies for what they believed. Unfortunately, a few died, some great artists. So I gravitated more towards painting of the 80s. And I was amazed, and then the East Village started, everybody went pirate. Once a little bit of money in art started having sex, the East Village opened, and I just thought anything was possible. But of course, what happened in the end is money moved in, artists smell the honey smell, and I don't blame them, and they'll join bigger galleries. And that has repeated on and on till we're all going to work for Larry Gagosian. But that model is boring. That model is dead, even though we give 99% of our attention to it. But that model is how I see the art world, that everybody is a lifer, everybody means it, that even that Teletubby Jeff Koons could make a great work of art again.
When was the last time you think you did?
The book begins with one of the great public sculptures of the last century, the 43-foot topiary puppy of a Norwich Terrier in front of the Rockefeller Center, which I always contended had Osama bin Laden stood in front of that sculpture. It emitted so much pure joy, empty joy, that all the evil in your body would leave you. It also had something that, oddly enough, Carl Walker's great sugar sphinx out in the factory had, where it needed no explanation. It was a force of nature unto itself, and insiders and outsiders could look at it almost equal. Leave it to the art magazines to change that. But as different as those two artists, they're ambitious. They wanted big audiences. Do you need a small audience? Nothing wrong with that. Nothing. I always felt good with the small audience until I didn't. And then I thought, I want to speak to everybody everywhere and see if I can create a level playing field. And again, this criticism of permission that I'm trying to write, of honesty, vulnerability, opinion, and permission. Too much criticism has no opinion anymore. It's boring.
Well, when you were talking about the criticism that you were first sort of imitating when you were starting out, it was, very arcane, technical, academic language. There's a perspective on the contemporary art world that it has many of those same flaws, which is to say it's conversation directed inward, only for people in the know. But the two artists that you were just highlighting a minute ago, Jeff Koons and Cara are both people who are working at a very different scale, in a different kind of register. So how important is it to try to speak directly to people as opposed to other artists?
I think the most private kind of conversation can be very public. A whispered painting, a love poem, a song, a small performance can actually reach out, but I don't know if that's what you're asking.
Well, I guess I mean, when I think about those two examples in particular, you see explosions of accessibility. And there are many layers and levels to each of those works, but they are also, as you were saying, just immediately, sort of gobsmacking. But that's relatively rare. How important is it in the sort of long sweep perspective for artists to make work that is legible on first glance?
Right. Legibility, I'll tell you what beauty is. Beauty is what works. It might be an all-white painting or an all-black painting that can change lives. It can be Matisse painting bathers by a river in the simplest, dorky way ever, just with insane color. Beauty is what works. I'm looking for works of art that have a moment of being convincing. You see, I post stuff, if you follow me on Instagram, every morning, 5 or 6 artists. I don't know who they are. I found them being a hashtag archaeologist of going to your page, seeing something I like, but not enough. Then you led me to her page, and then hers led me to hers, and I post it because it had 1 second of something convincing. And I think that 1% or 1% of something convincing can grow like a burning bush, that much more energy can pour out of one dumb idea. You all know where your ideas come from. And you don't. You have no idea where they come from. But one little idea like the uninhabitable earth, you suddenly realize contains multitudes. About being accessible, as I say, beauty is what works. Everybody has a different sense of beauty. To me, this is a subjective field. You cannot prove that Vermeer is better than Norman Rockwell, who I write about in the book. And I also write about George Bush's insane, weird folk paintings. And I liked the one of him in the bathtub looking at his feet and him in the shower looking at himself. And I thought, here's a war criminal, a gremlin on the wing of my country, who had all the power on earth and all the money and Texas, everything, and that was his inner life. And when I wrote this about him, the art world tore me a new one. We have to be honest with what we're thinking and seeing and feeling. Is his work accessible? I'm afraid so.
It's not going to end up in a museum anytime soon, though, or
Will
is it
it be
already
in a museum? It should probably be in a presidential.
Or something. Yeah.
It what?
Go into Crystal Bridges or something.
And now we're seeing like the climate protests, but let's not talk about that. I'll bring the whole fucking thing down.
Well, I did want. No, can we talk about it?
Yeah. What I think. What do you think? Because you're the greatest climate writer I think alive. Period. You changed the conversation from, oh, it's
Jerry,
all going to
stop changing the subject. Stop filibustering. Tell us what you think about the soup protest.
I'm a filibuster. What do I think of it? It made me sick. It made me sick to my goddamn stomach. Then I remembered. I thought, why do you have to attack other people's idea of beauty? You're going to stop all exhibitions. It's never, ever going to be possible to loan paintings ever again. the security state of how we're going to have to exhibit work is going to be ridiculous. The insurance, the loans, never going to happen. You're going to have timed hours, cameras, guards that can never stop anything. No guard can stop anything. You're attacking one beauty to get attention on another problem. And I think you're making a joke out of both, frankly. Now, the problem is they always say, but it has glass. And the truth is, eventually it's not going to have glass. We all know that. It's obvious. On the other hand, the first thing any invading army does is destroy the art of the culture it's taking over. On the other hand, when I was young, Tony Shafrazi painted over the Guernica when I was about 20-something. And I remember being in my suburb going, right on, man, stop the war. It's a paradox. I wish wouldn't happen. You're a climate person. What do you think? Could you stop them for us?
Yeah.
Couldn't they just glue themselves to a coal factory? Or that wouldn't work.
I think what they would say is that they've done that and nobody cared.
But now we're all paying attention. It's the damn truth. That's the paradox.
Well, what's interesting about it to me is so many people to whom these works don't mean much got very offended.
It's like when Notre Dame caught on fire. It was the most published picture of all time. Odd thing.
And what do you think that's about? For
A
people
loss-
to get obsessed about
A loss
Van
of
Gogh.
totemic structure on the interior life where we don't know what art is for. We're afraid inside from our PTSD. We still are attached to older ideas of culture, that it should last. And as an insider, I really want it to last, but I also know, like I used that statistic before, about 1% of 1% of 1% of all art made lasts. And now, only 1% of 1% of 1% of what we look at in our best museums will still be there in 200 years. It'll all change. So, do I hope they don't destroy a Van Gogh? I really do. I have to say it was kind of creative to glue your head to a painting.
He didn't make it, though. He didn't.
He's too
dry.
bald.
Yeah.
He needed hair. Excuse me, you, me, we need hair. It would have been an amazing sight. But, so you're feeling okay about it from your position in your world?
I mean, from a perspective of like campaign strategy, it seems mostly to have backfired. But I'm interested in that backfire event as a sociological phenomenon. That is to say, like there are, it just produced an enormous amount of outrage. Whereas, if that painting had been deaccessioned from the museum and never seen again by the public, none of those people would have been angry.
No, or if it was a Jeff Koons. That's what I wanted to write about. See?
But all those people were Jeff Koons of their day. We think of them as being in part of the canon, but they were not working in the canon.
Do you see why we work together so well? No, but that's really true. They were hated once upon a time. They were Jeff Koons.
It's kind of weird they're in a museum now.
Kind of weird.
Yeah.
I mean, they wanted to be the same way all artists do want to be taken home at night and lived with and loved.
But even thinking about Van Gogh, I mean, this is not an era in which like major public museums were a part of the, mainstream culture or whatever.
No.
So what he wanted was to be collected by rich people.
His brother worked for the Larry Gagosian of his time. He was the most connected artist possibly in the world. He showed at the Larry Gagosian gallery.
And nobody bought him anyway.
And one person bought his painting for about the same price that bought a Gauguin. And he got a rave from Roberta Smith, my wife, the New York Times, the equivalent of the best Paris critic alive at that time. He was poor and famous. All of our idiot myths about Van Gogh, he wasn't misunderstood in the least. Every artist knew every move he made. Like all artists, he's like a smelly shaman living on the edge of the village. that is making things saying, you need what I'm making to save or change your life. Now, as far as destroying paintings go, I don't know, it sure put up, it throws, again, it made the climate people a joke, where everybody, even me and you, thought, well, you used air conditioning this week. You drove there. It's that same thing they used to attack Al Gore for, calling attention to a terrible problem, and then the right wing would go, but you took a jet. We're not allowed to talk about anything.
I mean, we're talking about it now, right?
We're talking about it now.
Should we do some questions? What's the state?
Can we have house lights so we can see you and you can see us?
Thank you.
It would be fun. You're so sexy. I'd love, oh, thank you, all the way up.
Yeah.
Oh my, look at that. There's another question. And I have one point about questions, especially for men. You listening to me? You have to ask a question.
No, I'm asking the questions.
Oh. No statement.
I've got them, yeah.
I don't like statements after, because then psychotics like me start talking in the audience. Okay.
So the first question is about Roberta.
Roberta.
Wanting to hear a little bit how she's doing, but I would also take the opportunity to piggyback on that and ask you a little bit to talk about her as a partner in crime, a sounding board, a collaborator, and a model. I mean, so first tell us a little bit about how Roberta's doing, but also tell us what she's meant to you as a critic.
Roberta came down with COVID yesterday. I had full-on geezer COVID in March, lost my smell. It came back, you're safe. And she's on that Paxil or whatever that drug is, and she'll have a rebound case. I haven't told her. But she's doing great, and all that's good. What about me? Living with another critic is an incredible thing. I love it. We're both lashed ourselves to the same mast of the ship of art. But oddly enough, I see in one direction, and I think my wife sees in another. She's looking like this at art, examining every inch of it, where I'm looking at it like this, on a table, on a stage, in an auditorium, in a building, in a neighborhood, in a city, blah, and then the history of all of those things. I write from my weakness. Matisse never drew feet because he couldn't. It's a great solution. All artists in this room and all writers know you get around your problem. She can write about art, I think, like there's no tomorrow. And she motivates me. She's she's a Quaker. She can't lie. Imagining sleeping with somebody that's a Quaker, you know. A lot of pressure there. No, kidding. You know her. What was your sense of her?
Yeah, no bullshit.
No bullshit. Like this. Her. And it's great of a bullshitter to live with somebody that won't take it. And it saved my life. Because I wanted to dance and fake my way through all of it when I was 40. And I got lucky. And we met each other, and we've never been apart from the first day. Two orphans who are not part of the world. All we do is see shows, 25 or 30 shows a week. When you might go to parties or an after party or dinner with friends, we get a slice of pizza on a paper plate. He attacked me online because I put ketchup on my pizza. Is it that unusual? And then we go home and do our notes. We're not. People don't know this about me. You do. That I'm insanely bashful. You would never know that. Do you see how I cover it? I can talk to a room of 100, 200 people. But did I ever go to sit-down dinners with our friends? Never.
Well, that's always seemed to me to be something that she gave you that was so precious, was that she allowed you to have a space where you weren't performing. And when I don't have access to it directly, but when I think of the two of you just sitting there quietly typing all day, it's just a very different way of being in the world than you are like when you come to the office or when you go to galleries or...
It's true.
Yeah.
We saved each other. We say that to each other all the time.
Well, what did you give to her?
Hmm?
What did you give to her?
I wonder, like all couples, you go, what did I really give you? I did a lot by being this outer-facing person, at least online and in larger spaces. I've brought Roberta into that, where she would not come in. She does not present as an easy person to approach. It's that simple, because she's always looking at things. And I have to drag her over going, speak to that person. And then she'll amaze you with her observations and her insights. So we've given each other, she gave me an inner life, and I gave her an outer life. And I've tried to give her stuff in her criticism. Never once have I landed an idea. And he gave me some of my very best stuff in this book. It's true. People sometimes compliment me on certain parts of my work, and I go, well, David Wallace-Wells suggested I go there. But it's great living with another critic, and I wouldn't do it any other way. I'm so lucky. And she should get a Pulitzer. I love mine, but I think she's the greatest art critic alive and that may have ever lived.
She's great.
Yeah.
It seems to me that many discussions of art focus on a message, and yet for me the experience has always been of feeling. Why are we afraid to talk about, he or she wrote aesthetics, but maybe just feeling is even a stronger word?
I would say that we're dividing things. I think that's a very, very good question, but I think that it's a little bit odd because there is no thought without feeling, and there is no feeling without thought. It is not humanly possible. After the Cartesian, Western, Platonic philosophers, especially in the West, we would divide things into two, this or that, male or female, black or white. But I have a theory called the whole ball of wax. And I grew up with only men, 5 brothers, a father, no mother, no sisters, no nieces, no grandmothers. So I sort of hate men, not him. And I thought I saw women seeing everything connected to everything, and the beauty, the simple complication of the entire world. And I thought that's what art is. Pleasure is an important form of knowledge, like I said earlier, and that everything's in play and everything's kind of connected. So when we're talking about an idea, if it's just message, I just saw a show the other day I wrote about, and I said, they were boring black and white pictures of clouds, and the dealer said, aren't these amazing clouds? Aren't they powerful because they were taken over Ferguson, Missouri? And I went, no, they're very boring, generic photographs. They have no message and no feeling. So what does Mozart mean? We don't know. You owe it to the world not to know that. So I'd say they're part of the same thing.
Yeah, I think there's also something about being embarrassed about being so vulnerable that you defend yourself with ideas.
Ideas. And that happens in the art world. The problem is, on the other side, you feeling people, can I talk to you? With those people that go, hey man, I can't talk about my work, I just feel it. It's like, oh, shut up. Get a grip, you male painter. No. You are the only, if not the best, representative of your art on earth, and you better be able to talk about it in 122 words without using the word oppositions of nature and culture and the Western and Platonic idea. Fuck off. Just say, when I was young, I used to love magic tricks, or whatever is going on. Don't. We're all afraid. We're all embarrassed. That's the price of admission to the house of art. to the house of writing, to the house of taking the dumbest idea, and that's the one. Often, aren't you shocked at what goes in your work? Aren't you completely amazed? I am.
All right, Jerry Saltz, thank you.
Thank you, David Wallace-Wells. You're great.
For coming.
Thank you. Now, let me just say something. Selfies will be taken. You own the photo. Anything you do with them, that's fine. Don't shake our hands, because now I'm really COVID squirrely. And I'm going to go out there, I think, and sign books. Is that right? Or is that here? I'll do something. And wait in line and be nice. Thank you for coming. I love him. I love you. Thank you. Thank you, David.
Thank you.